Hi, my name's Rachel and welcome to the sewing tutorial for the cropped baby doll jacket sewing pattern, which you can find in my Etsy shop linked below. This project is intermediate, but a confident beginner could also tackle it. And this pattern can be made with a variety of fabrics, light to medium weight, depending on what kind of look you want, whether you want more of a jacket feel or more of a summery spring blouse feel. There's some cute pleats on the front that look like a waterfall, and it also has a nice pleat on the back, and the jacket has an overall A-line shape. Super breezy and comfy, and if you'd like to make your own, just keep watching. First, we'll start with the pleats on the front pieces. For each pleat, pinch the fabric till the center line of each rectangle comes up, and then fold down the pleat towards the side seam. This means that the right side will be folded towards the right, and the left side will be folded towards the left. Since the pleats are evenly spaced, each fold should be nestled right beside the pleat beside it. Once they're all pinned down, give them a quick press to make them easier for you to sew, then sew down each pleat with a 0.3 seam allowance, stopping at the end of each rectangle that you traced out. In order to make sure that my seams are really nice and straight, I'm using these lines on my presser foot to get an even 0.3 seam allowance for all the pleats. And just to note that since these stitches are visible on the garment, especially if you use contrasting thread, any crooked lines will be visible. So take extra care to go slowly and ensure your stitches are even and parallel to each other. After you finish sewing the pleats, finish the top edge of both front bottom pieces and the bottom edge of both front top pieces. I'm using a serger, but you could also use a zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger. So this is what your pieces should look like. Now we're going to stitch together the front top and the front bottom pieces on both sides. To do this, pin these two pieces together, matching the notches, and stitch down in place with a 1 cm seam allowance. So I had to refilm this step because the first time I filmed it, my phone fell down and I only filmed the floor. So that's why the pieces look a little bit different and the edges aren't finished. But don't worry, these are the same two pieces. I'm just refilming this on some scrap fabric. But you'll notice in this clip that I first matched up the notches and then sewed inwards from the center front and the shoulder seam towards the curved part of the front pieces. That's because the front piece can be a little bit tricky to sew in the curve, so by sewing inwards towards the curve, I'm making sure that the pieces don't shift around. Then, once you finally get around to sewing the curve, if you're still having trouble getting it to be nice and smooth, you can put little slits within the seam allowance to help you make a flat surface for you to sew on. Just be sure not to make the slits too deep because then you'll cut into your seam allowance and then potentially have a small hole on the front. And then I just ease the fabric in just like I would a sleeve with some ease built in. Iron especially the corner and use the tip of the iron to really get in there to make sure it's all nice and smooth, and then clip into your seam allowance around the curve. This will help make the curve more flexible, and then press the seam open. It should look like this once you're done. Now we're going to top stitch that seam with a 0.3 cm seam allowance. All the top stitching in this pattern uses a 0.3 seam allowance and is optional, so it's really if you like the look of top stitching you can do it. If you don't, you can skip this. Next, we're going to move on to the back, and we're going to start again with the pleat on the back bottom piece. This pleat is a box pleat and is different from the pleats we did on the front pieces. So to get these pleats ready, instead of pinching the fabric up and folding down, we're actually going to bring the outermost lines of the pleat in towards the center crease of the back piece and then pin these down. Then we're going to baste these stitches down so it doesn't shift using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You'll have to remove these stitches later, so if you want to make it easier for yourself, you could use a different color thread to make it easier to unpick later, which I didn't do, but I wish I did. And then once you finish basting down the pleat, finish the top edge of the back bottom piece, and then on the back top piece, finish all the edges except for the sides. Now we're just going to pin both back pieces right sides together and then sew. Once you finish sewing that, you can then rip out the basting stitches, and then you're going to press that seam open and top stitch if you'd like. If you do decide to top stitch and decide to top stitch below your first line of stitching, I did leave a little break in my stitches at the pleat so that way the pleat can freely move. You could also top stitch the other side of your original seam. This is what your back piece should look like now. Next, moving on to the shoulder and side seams, finish the side seams, shoulder seams, and front and back necklines. And then pin and sew the shoulder and side seams together, again using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then press open all the seams once you're done. Now we're moving on to the facing. So start by ironing on the interfacing to your facing pieces and finish all the raw edges of the facing. Then sew your facing pieces together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then press the seams open once you're done. Now before we pin the facings on to get ready to sew, we're going to get the elastic closure ready since we'll have to sandwich this elastic piece in between the body pieces and the facing pieces on the front of the jacket. So cut enough elastic to tie a knot and then cut off any excess cord. Now pin the facings to the top. sandwich the loop right here. Pin the elastic at the highest point on the front middle seam. Now we'll sew around all the facings with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and we'll also sew 1 centimeter across the bottom of the facing. It might seem wrong, but we're going to finish the hem later, just trust me. So this is what you should have now. Next, we'll just clip the corners at the top and bottom of the center seams to make sure that the corners can be turned out and be nice and pointy. And then we're also going to create slits in the seam allowance around the neckline to make sure that the curve of the neckline is more flexible once we turn the facing back down. Now moving on to understitching. So understitching will help stop the facing from rolling out and being visible from the outside of the garment. So we'll first flip the facing right side out and press and push the seam allowance towards the facing. Then we'll sew all the way around the facing, again with a 0.3 seam allowance, and when understitching you should be catching both the facing and the seam allowance within this stitch. It'll be hard to get your presser foot all the way into any corners of the garment to understitch, so just sew as close as you can to that corner, and then we'll hand stitch any remaining sections that still need understitching. This is what your understitching should look like. Now before I move on to the hem, I'm also going to give all the facings a good press. And I'm also going to hand stitch down the facing to the seam allowance at the shoulder and at the front to also help keep the facings from flipping out. These stitches should only be on the seam allowance, so you won't be able to see them on the front of the garment at all. Now onto the hem. We're going to finish the hem of this top with bias tape. You can buy pre-made bias tape, but you can also make it yourself by cutting your fabric into strips on the bias and ironing. When cutting into strips, a 45-degree angle would be best, but I'm just trying to use my fabric efficiently here, so it's not a perfect 45-degree angle, but it's close enough. Keep cutting long strips until you get the length of your hem. You can cut multiple strips and then sew them right sides together at a perfect 45-degree angle. If you are connecting strips, remember to trim off any excess fabric to reduce bulk. Press open any of your seams. Then we just need to iron the long strip by first folding it in half in the center, then unfolding it and then bringing both outer edges to the center crease and ironing again. So this is what your bias tape should look like. So now moving on to actually using this bias tape to finish the hem. So here's what your piece should look like as you start. A raw hem that is flipped inside the facing. So first we're going to want to flip the facing back out so the hem is easy to access. And the first step to use the bias tape is to unfold the bias tape and sew the bias tape right sides together onto your hem, and make sure that the bias tape overlaps with the facing, so that way when you flip the facing back out again, the edge of the bias tape will be hidden underneath the facing. Here I'm sewing with a 1 cm seam allowance, and if this is your first time using bias tape, I would recommend pinning it all the way first. I just got really lazy. And when you're going around the curves, make sure you don't pull on the bias tape at all. It could warp the look of your hem, so just make sure you lay it nice and flat. And here I'm just showing you how I'm making sure the bias tape overlaps with the facing on the other end of the hem as well. I then trim off any excess bias tape if you have any. Step 2 of using the bias tape, we're going to fold over the bias tape so the right side is now facing you, and then we're going to sew the edge along the edge that we just sewed, but on the right side. And here I'm using a 0.3 cm seam allowance. This is what you should have now. Final step of the bias tape. Fold the bias tape once so that you're encasing the raw edge. And then fold it one more time so that the line you just sewed is right side up but on the wrong side of the body pieces. Then make sure you're laying it nice and flat and sew the other edge that you haven't sewn yet of the bias tape. And I used a 0.3 cm seam allowance. And when you're sewing this, I flipped the corners of the facing back out to make it easier for me to sew. So this is what you should have, and now you're done the hem. You just need to flip all your facings back right sides out and push out your corners. And then because you probably couldn't sew all the way into the corners, in the last step, I'm just machine sewing the hem to the edge on the front, so that way it looks nice and clean from the outside. And then sew on your button and you're almost done. We just need to do the sleeves. So for the sleeves, we're first going to finish these short raw edges and then sew them together and then press them open the same way you did for the rest of the seams that we pressed open. Next, flip your jacket inside out and we'll start pinning on the sleeves. Make sure you have right sides together and match up the notches. I marked the front and back notches here in red to make it easier for you to see in the video, but the back of the sleeve has 2 notches while the front has 1. And when pinning, I always like to start with the sleeve at the side and shoulder seams, and then I move on to the front and back notches. The sleeve has some ease built in to make it more comfortable for you to wear and move in, so around the top of the sleeve between the notches, you'll have to evenly distribute the fabric, pin and sew. Then go ahead, check your sleeve stitches to make sure they're all nice and smooth, and if you like what you see, go ahead and finish the raw edges of this seam. And finally, to hem the sleeves, I just folded the fabric up 1 centimeter twice and sewed a simple straight stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I did iron this beforehand to make sure that it was nice and crisp, and I recommend to you to do so as well to make sure it looks extra beautiful. And then you're done! So hope you enjoyed this tutorial and be sure to share your creation. Goodbye!